The man behind the counter didn't even glance up when he said it. "Sir, this line's for paying customers only." Vernon had already paid. The receipt was still in his hand. But he didn't argue. Just nodded, stepped back, and waited like a stranger in a place he used to call familiar. What does it do to a man to serve with honor and still be looked at like he doesn't belong? It was just after 7 a.m. when Staff Sergeant Vern Rucker walked into the corner diner on Maple Avenue. Same place he'd gone for years. Same table near the window. But that morning, on his 59th birthday, no one said a word. Not even a nod from the waitress who used to ask about his grandkids. He sat down slowly, his knees stiff from old service injuries, and placed his VA card on the table next to his wallet. Not because he had to, but because after all this time, he still felt the need to prove something. That he'd earned his place. Outside, the bus stop filled with chatter, two kids laughing, a man arguing into his phone. Inside, silence. Just the scrape of a fork on ceramic and the low hum of a tired ceiling fan. His coffee came lukewarm, served without eye contact. No candle. No mention of the date. No call or text from family. The only thing that arrived was the quiet. And Vern let it. He folded his receipt, tucked it into his coat, and walked out the door without touching the toast. He didn't know it yet, but that small humiliation, the one that looked so ordinary to everyone else, was only the beginning. At the bus stop near the VA clinic, Vernon waited. Not for a ride. Just for a pause in the day. The bench was cold through his coat, but he didn't shift. He sat still, palms resting flat on his thighs, shoulders squared like the old days. Across the street, a man carried balloons into a bakery, blue and gold, birthday colors. Vern looked away before the doorbell chimed. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He let it ring through. When the voicemail pinged, he checked. It was Malcolm. No message, just the missed call. Same number that hadn't called in months. He stared at the screen a moment too long, then locked it and slipped it back into his coat. Later, at the hardware store, he needed a new light bulb for the porch. The clerk was younger, barely out of high school. The kind that smiled more at the screen than the customer. When Vernon placed the bulb on the counter, the boy hesitated. "You military?" he asked, pointing at the faded patch on Vern's cap. Vern nodded once. The boy looked unsure. "You got ID or something?" Vern didn't answer right away. Just pulled out the same one card he always carried. The boy barely glanced at it before ringing him up, no discount, no nod. Just a receipt crumpled and handed across the counter without a word. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves skated across the sidewalk, catching against his boots. He stood still for a beat longer than needed before walking back toward the bus stop, light bulb in hand. That night, he ate alone. Again. A can of chili warmed on the stove, the kind Tanya used to say had too much salt, not enough soul. He left it simmering too long, let it thicken, then ate it anyway. The television played old war documentaries he didn't watch, just kept on for noise. The apartment was neat. Always had been. A framed photo of Tanya sat on the bookshelf next to the folded flag and the dog tags. He dusted them every Sunday. Even on his birthday. By the time the sky went dark, no one had come. No knock. No call back. No card in the mailbox. The house was quiet in the way houses get when they're waiting for someone who isn't coming. Vern took the bulb from the bag, replaced the porch light himself. It flickered once, then steadied. A small thing. But sometimes small things were all a man had left to hold on to. The next morning, Vernon woke early. Not out of habit, but because sleep never stayed long anymore. He sat at the edge of the bed, one sock on, one off, watching the sliver of morning light crawl across the carpet. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet for a birthday that had passed without so much as a knock or a call. By 8 a.m., he was at the credit union. He didn't wear his service cap this time. Didn't feel like being asked about it. The clerk behind the counter recognized him but didn't smile. Just nodded, typed something into the system, and waited for him to speak. "I need to update my beneficiaries," he said plainly, voice low but steady. The woman blinked, then nodded. "Of course, Mr. Rucker. We'll need to verify your information." The paperwork was simple. A few pages. A few checkboxes. Lines to initial. Vern took his time. Read every word. When it asked for next of kin, he paused. His pen hovered over the line, then moved past it. He listed instead a non-profit he'd heard about, one that helped veterans transition out of homelessness. The space beneath the relationship to you field stayed blank. Back home, he pulled out the small metal box where Tanya used to keep their papers. Wills. Insurance. Deeds. He slid it open, careful not to disturb the envelope she'd labeled in her handwriting, "For Nikki." He'd seen it 100 times. Still hadn't opened it. He took out the deed to the house they used to share in Virginia. It was rented now. Managed by a local company. No one in the family had asked about it in years. They probably thought it was gone. He made a quiet note to transfer it, moved the title fully into the trust he'd been building since the year after Tanya passed. One step at a time. Outside, the mail truck rolled past without stopping. Nothing today. Just the wind and the dry rustle of leaves skimming across the walk. That afternoon, he went to the print shop downtown. Not the fancy chain store, but the small family-owned place near the old laundromat. The man behind the counter wore glasses thick enough to make his eyes look soft and blurred. He offered no small talk. Just asked, what size prints you need. Vernon handed him a USB drive. Just one page, he said. Single-sided. Heavy paper. The page was simple. No color. No flourish. Just a plain letterhead and a list of updates. Legal. Binding. Quiet. He paid in cash, nodded his thanks, and walked out with the page tucked neatly into a manila envelope. No one asked what it was. No one needed to. At the bus stop again, he waited. This time, not because he had nowhere to be, but because it was the only place left in town where he could sit and not be expected to speak. He placed the envelope inside his coat, buttoned it shut, and rested both hands on the bench beside him. No movement. No sound. Just a man with nothing left to prove, preparing for what came next. It was just after noon when the knock came. Not the quick kind, not urgent. 3 slow taps. Even. Almost polite. Vernon had been sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of lukewarm tea in front of him, steam long since gone. The knock didn't startle him. He waited a moment, then stood. The hallway creaked as he walked toward the door. Through the peephole, he saw Malcolm. And behind him, Nicole. A coat too thin for the weather, arms crossed tight over her chest. Vernon didn't move right away. Just rested one hand on the doorknob. Then, with a quiet breath, he opened it. Malcolm smiled like it was easy. "Hey, Dad. Can we come in?" Vernon stepped aside without a word. The two of them entered, eyes flicking around the room. Nicole paused by the bookshelf, looking briefly at the photo of Tanya before glancing away. Malcolm stood, hands in his jacket pockets, trying to seem casual. But there was tension in his shoulders, like someone who came to ask for something but hadn't figured out how yet. We wanted to check on you," Malcolm said. "Didn't hear from you on your birthday." Vernon didn't answer. He pulled out a second chair at the table, gestured slightly. Nicole sat. Malcolm didn't. "We know things haven't been great," he continued, shifting his weight. "But family's still family, right?" Still no reply. Nicole finally spoke, her voice softer than her father's. "I told him we should have called sooner. I'm sorry we didn't." Vernon looked at her for a moment, then down at her hands, which fidgeted with the zipper of her purse. She'd grown. She used to sit on this very floor with her crayons and ask about Tanya's garden. Malcolm cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said, finally getting to it. "The house in Virginia. We heard it's still in your name. And, well, we're kind of in a bind." Vernon didn't move. Just listened. Malcolm kept going. "We were hoping maybe you could transfer it to us. Or help us refinance it. Nicole's student loans are piling up. You've done well, Dad. We're not asking for much." Nicole looked away. Vernon reached into a drawer, pulled out a folded envelope, and laid it on the table without opening it. The manila edges were worn from time, but the seal was untouched. He pushed it gently toward Nicole. She looked confused. "It's from your grandmother," Vernon said quietly. "She wrote it for you. I was waiting for the right time." Nicole took it with both hands. She didn't open it. Just held it to her chest like it might break. Malcolm leaned forward. "Dad, look, this isn't about guilt or anything. We just need a little help." Vernon stood. Malcolm paused. "So, is that a yes?" Vernon walked to the window. The sun had dipped just enough to cast long shadows on the porch. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "The house is spoken for." A beat of silence stretched between them. Malcolm exhaled through his nose, then picked up his coat. "I see. Well, thanks for the tea." Nicole followed him out quietly, envelope still in hand. Vernon didn't close the door right away. He watched as they walked down the steps, side by side, without looking back. Then, gently, he shut the door and locked it. Not in anger. Just to keep the cold from getting in. The next morning, Vernon sat at the community center, a clipboard resting on his knee. He wasn't signing up for anything. He just liked the quiet there. The front windows let in soft light, and the folding chairs never asked questions. Across the room, Tyrone Harris Young, still sharp in the shoulders, was running a group session for new veterans. Vern watched, not as a mentor, not as a peer, but as someone who'd already walked through the fire and no longer needed to explain how it felt. When the session ended, Tyrone walked over, offered a small nod, and sat beside him. They didn't speak. They rarely had to. Sometimes Tyrone would ask a question about the old days. Sometimes Vern would answer. Today wasn't one of those days. Back home, a yellow envelope waited in the mailbox. Handwritten. No return address. The kind of envelope that bent slightly at the corners, as if someone had held it too tightly before letting it go. Vernon carried it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and left it unopened. The house was quiet. He watered Tanya's peace lily, wiped down the kitchen counter, and adjusted the frame on the hallway wall. The smallest things held weight now, like making sure no one walked through dust in their memory. By evening, the phone rang. Once. Then again. Caller ID, Malcolm R. He didn't pick up. Let it go to voicemail. It rang again 5 minutes later. Same number. Still no answer. When the third call came, Vern stood beside the phone, listening to it buzz against the table. Then, just as it stopped, there was another knock at the door. This time, no hesitation. Vern opened it to see Malcolm again. Alone. I brought the paperwork, Malcolm said, holding up a thin manila folder. Just in case you reconsidered. Vern looked at the folder, then at his son. I'm not here to argue, Malcolm added quickly. Just wanted to explain. I know you don't owe us anything. But Nikki's scared. I messed up. I just thought maybe you could help us fix it. Vern didn't take the folder. Didn't invite him in. Instead, he stepped out onto the porch, letting the doors shut behind him. They stood side by side, watching the street lamp flicker on across the road. The silence was long. Not heavy. Not cruel. Just enough space to hear the wind thread through the trees. Malcolm cleared his throat, then set the folder down on the porch railing. Whether you read it or not, thank you for opening the door. Vern didn't reply. He didn't need to. Malcolm turned to leave. As he reached the sidewalk, he paused, then looked back once. Vern was still there, still standing, hands in his coat pockets, head tilted slightly toward the sky like he was listening for something only he could hear. Inside, the envelope from earlier remained unopened on the kitchen table. The folders sat untouched on the porch rail. And Vernon Rucker, staff sergeant, father, man left behind, chose, once again, to say more by saying nothing at all. By the time Saturday rolled around, the sky had dropped into that soft gray that never quite turned to rain. Vernon walked 3 blocks to the high school auditorium. Not for a performance, not for a ceremony, just to sit in the back row of something he'd quietly funded months ago, a scholarship ceremony for first-generation college-bound students. His name wasn't in the program. He hadn't wanted it to be. Inside, the walls were lined with folding chairs, creaking softly under Sunday clothes. The stage was modest. A banner read "Tomorrow's Voices, Today's Roots." A girl stood at the microphone, holding a sheet of paper with 2 hands that shook just a little. My name is Jasmine Brooks, she said, voice uneven. I'm the first in my family to go to college. My mother works nights. My father passed when I was 11. And for a long time, I didn't think college was for people like me. The audience was quiet. No phones. No shuffling. Just the sound of one young woman trying to stand in her truth. She continued, slower now. But someone I never met believed in me. Someone who put their faith not in a name or a story, but in potential. And because of that, because of them, I'll be starting at Howard University this fall. Vernon sat still, his hands folded over the curve of his cane. He didn't blink as Jasmine stepped off the stage. Didn't move when the applause came. Only when she passed down the aisle and glanced his way, just for a second, with eyes full of knowing, did he nod once. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Leaves scraped against the sidewalk in soft spirals. Vernon stood under the awning, watching families take photos on the steps, mothers fussing with ties, fathers pretending not to smile too wide. Jasmine stood with a small group, holding a rolled certificate. She didn't wave. She didn't have to. Walking home, Vernon passed the church on 8th Street, the same one Tanya used to volunteer at. The bell tower was quiet, but the front garden had been redone, neatly trimmed hedges, fresh mulch, and rows of lilies just beginning to open. He paused at the gate. He didn't go in. He simply stood there, letting the stillness settle. Then, slowly, he pulled a crumpled flyer from his coat pocket, the one from the scholarship committee, the one with Jasmine's essay printed in small font on the back. He folded it again, smaller this time, and slipped it into his wallet. Back at the apartment, the house smelled faintly of coffee and cedar polish. The folder Malcolm had left was still on the porch rail. Damp at the corners now. Vernon didn't bring it in. Instead, he opened the envelope that had arrived days earlier, the one with no return address. Inside was a card. No message. Just a pressed yellow rose, brittle and clean. He placed it gently on the windowsill, next to Tanya's peace lily. It tilted slightly to one side, like it had traveled far to get there. And maybe it had. Sunday morning came slow. The kind of quiet that settled over the neighborhood like dust, gentle, unnoticed, but everywhere. Vernon stood in the kitchen, steam rising from the kettle, his fingers wrapped around the worn handle of Tanya's favorite mug. He didn't drink tea much these days, but he kept the routine. Some things weren't habits, they were anchors. On the table sat 2 envelopes. One was stamped and sealed, addressed to Attorney Gregory Wilson. The other was unmarked, except for a single line written in Vernon's own hand, "Return to sender." He walked it out to the mailbox himself. Steady steps. No cane today. The envelope dropped into the metal with a quiet thud. A sound no one else would hear, but to Vernon, it echoed. Back inside, the apartment felt too still. So he opened the window just enough to let in the breeze. It carried the scent of cut grass and car exhaust, real things. Present things. He stood there a while, leaning against the frame, watching a boy ride his bike in slow loops around the corner. Later, Tyrone Harris stopped by. Unannounced, as usual. He carried a 6-pack of ginger ale and a small envelope. "From Jasmine," he said. "Said you probably wouldn't want a fuss, so she kept it short." Vernon nodded, took the envelope, and placed it next to the one from earlier. Tyrone didn't ask questions. He never did. They sat on the porch, not talking, not needing to. The sun dipped behind the low row of houses across the street. Streetlights hadn't come on yet. That in-between time. Just light enough to see, just quiet enough to feel. Vernon reached for the envelope from Jasmine. Opened it slowly. Inside was a photo. Her in her dorm room, books piled high, smile wide, a folded American flag on the shelf behind her. Below the picture, in her handwriting, "Still making you proud, I hope." He held it for a long time. Then placed it inside the same frame that used to hold a family photo. The old picture of Malcolm, Nikki, Tanya, all smiling, had already been removed. That evening, he dusted the living room one last time. Set aside a box of things to donate. Folded the extra blankets. He didn't do it with finality, just care. as if preparing the space for someone who might visit someday. Or not. Before bed, he stepped out onto the porch again. The night air was cool now. The folder Malcolm had left was gone. Someone had picked it up, or the wind had claimed it. Either way, Vernon didn't go looking. He stood there a few more minutes, arms crossed loose over his chest. Then, with the same quiet steadiness he'd shown in every corner of his life, he turned back inside and locked the door behind him. The community center was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that made chairs creak louder and footsteps feel like something permanent. Vernon stood in the corner, watching the folding tables being arranged for the scholarship brunch. Tyrone was already at work, setting name tags beside each seat. A small stack of envelopes sat in the center of the table, modest awards, but meaningful. Vernon didn't wear a suit. Just his brown cardigan and clean slacks. The same polished shoes Tanya used to call his Sunday pair. He carried no papers, no announcements. Just the stillness of someone who decided to pass something on without asking for anything back. Jasmine arrived first. She didn't say much. Just walked up, smiled, and handed him a single-flowered deep orange, fresh from the street vendor's cart outside. No ribbon, no card. He accepted it like a folded flag. Then nodded toward the coffee urn. "They got that weak kind you like," he said. She laughed once, then moved to help. As the room slowly filled, the noise never quite rose above a murmur. Grandmothers sat beside grandsons. A retired bus driver chatted with a high school senior in a borrowed tie. There was no spotlight. No speeches. Just cinnamon rolls on paper plates, and chairs that scooted closer as stories were shared. When it was time, Vernon stepped forward. Not to give a speech, just to hand out the envelopes. One by one. Jasmine. Anthony. Kiara. Names called softly, without ceremony. Each student met his eyes. Each handshake lingered just a moment longer than formality required. No cameras flashed. But in the stillness, something else was captured. A kind of dignity that didn't need to announce itself. It lived in the way people leaned in when he spoke. In the way they stood just a bit straighter when they left his side. After the tables had been cleared, and the last thank you had been murmured, Vernon sat down beside the window. The late morning light hit the edge of the room, golden and soft. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the rose Jasmine had given him. Placed it on the windowsill next to a folded napkin with 2 words written in blocky handwriting. "Thank you." He didn't move for a while. Just sat there, letting the quiet settle around him. Outside, the wind stirred the branches. A group of kids ran by the open door, their laughter trailing behind like ribbons. Vernon smiled, almost to himself. He didn't need the family name anymore. Didn't need the approval. He had built something different now, something no court could dispute, and no bitterness could touch. A new legacy. One made not of blood, but of choice. And it was enough. There's a quiet kind of strength in choosing dignity over revenge. Vernon Rucker didn't raise his voice, didn't fight for attention, and didn't demand to be seen. Instead, he rebuilt his legacy not through bloodlines, but through intention, through a scholarship handed quietly across a folding table, a flower placed gently on a windowsill, a life lived with steady grace. His family tried to erase him. But instead of retaliating, he chose to invest in others who still believed in the future. That is where true power lives, not in what we inherit, but in what we choose to pass forward. If you've ever had to walk away from people who couldn't see your worth, If you've ever built something from the ground up and been told it was just luck, this story is for you. What does legacy mean to you? Is it a last name, or is it the lives you quietly uplift? If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Each week, we honor stories of strength, silence, and survival in the face of betrayal. You are not alone, and you never have to stay where you're not valued.